"If I heal your leg, will you give me food?" said Jesus Christ in disguise. The millionaire mocked him, but was left in shock. The question cut through the cold Chicago night with unsettling calm. Snow clung to the curb outside the glass-fronted hotel, where sirens had just faded, and a small crowd lingered, half curious, half impatient to return to warmth. At the center of it all stood Ethan Walker, a self-made millionaire whose tailored coat could not hide the pain etched across his face. His right leg throbbed from the accident moments earlier, twisted at an unnatural angle, each breath measured against the humiliation of being helped by strangers. Around him, security murmured into earpieces, aides whispered about calling a private orthopedic surgeon, and passers-by lifted phones, sensing a moment worth recording. In a city that never missed a spectacle, wealth in distress was always good theater. That was when the man stepped forward. He looked like he belonged nowhere near the hotel's marble entrance. Worn boots threadbare, coat hair streaked with gray. His voice, however, carried with a quiet authority that seemed to slow the noise around them. He did not ask for money. He did not beg. He simply looked at Ethan's injured leg and spoke the words that no one expected. "If I heal your leg, will you give me food?" For a second, no one reacted. Then laughter rippled through the small circle, sharp, dismissive, uncomfortable. Ethan forced a smile, the kind that had closed deals and silenced boardrooms. Food of all things. He had written checks larger than most people's lifetimes, funded galas where meals cost more than rent, and here stood a stranger, reducing his pain to a bowl of soup. Security shifted, ready to move the man away. Aides exchanged looks, already categorizing him as another opportunist drawn to money and misfortune. Even the phones tilted, capturing the mockery as if it were part of the show. Ethan scoffed, shaking his head despite the pain. He offered a sarcastic reply, something about ordering a whole restaurant if that was the price. To him, the question was absurd, an insult to science, to wealth, to control. Healing was bought, scheduled, insured. It did not come from men who asked for food. But the stranger did not flinch. He did not argue or explain. He only held Ethan's gaze, eyes steady, almost sorrowful, as if the laughter itself carried a heavier cost than the injury. Then in that frozen pause between mockery and dismissal, something shifted. The pain in Ethan's leg dulled, not vanished, but eased just enough for him to notice. His breath caught. The smile faltered. Around them, the crowd quieted, sensing that the joke had ended. And for the first time that night, the millionaire felt something far more unsettling than pain. Uncertainty. The sidewalk told two stories at once. On one side of the street, the hotel glowed like a glass fortress, its revolving doors swallowing warmth, money, and certainty. Inside, a charity gala was winding down, crystal glasses, clinked laughter, rose and fell, and valets lined up imported sedans as if they were chess pieces. The city's elite moved with practiced ease, insulated from consequence by tinted windows and trusted names. Across the curb, winter ruled without compromise. Snow packed itself into the cracks of the pavement. Steam curled from a subway grate, carrying the smell of iron and damp concrete. A woman in a thin jacket hurried past with her collar pulled high, while a delivery rider balanced against the wind, checking a cracked phone screen for the next order. This was Chicago as it actually breathed fast, cold and different. Ethan Walker stood exactly between those two worlds. His security detail formed a loose perimeter, black coats against white snow, murmuring updates and scanning faces. An aide had already called a private ambulance, insisting on discretion. Another whispered about liability, about optics, about how quickly this needed to disappear. To them, the street was a problem to be managed, not a place where people lived. A few steps away, the man who had spoken Jesus Christ in disguise remained still. He did not look at the hotel or the cameras. His attention stayed on the injured leg, on the human cost that money could not immediately erase. Around him, the crowd shifted uneasily. Some felt embarrassed for laughing earlier. Others grew impatient, eager for the spectacle to move on. A police cruiser rolled past slowly, its lights washing blue and red over faces from different worlds. In that brief flash, the contrast sharpened, designer shoes beside worn boots, silk scarves beside frayed sleeves, confidence beside quiet endurance. No speech could have explained it better. Ethan felt it too. The cold seeped through his coat as the adrenaline faded. Pain still pulsed in his leg, But now it competed with something else, a strange awareness that the street was not bending to his will. He could not buy silence from the wind or warmth from the snow. For the first time in years, he was forced to stand still and wait. Nearby, a homeless veteran watched with folded arms, skepticism etched deep. A hotel guest glanced between the stranger and Ethan, uneasy as if sensing a line had been crossed without anyone knowing when. Phones hovered lower now. Curiosity had turned into caution. The city kept moving around them. Buses hissed to a stop. A siren wailed in the distance. Somewhere above in a suite with floor-to-ceiling windows, a party continued uninterrupted. And right there on that narrow strip of pavement, the two Americas faced each other, one wrapped in glass, and guarantees the other exposed and honest. No contracts were signed, no money changed hands. Yet the ground itself seemed to wait as if asking which world would shape the next moment. Ethan shifted his weight, wincing. The question from earlier echoed louder now, not because it was dramatic, but because it belonged to this street, not the hotel. Food, not wealth, not power, just food. Power had always obeyed Ethan Walker. From boardrooms overlooking the Chicago River to private lounges 30 floors above the street, his presence carried an unspoken gravity. When Ethan entered a room, conversations adjusted, timelines accelerated, risks softened. Control to him was not an ambition, it was muscle memory, built deal by deal, acquisition by acquisition. If something broke, he replaced it. If someone resisted, he outlasted them. That mindset had followed him everywhere, even onto the frozen sidewalk. Security stood ready, waiting for instructions. Aides hovered close enough to hear every breath, already preparing statements in case tonight leaked beyond their control. Lawyers were a phone call away, surgeons another. Ethan did not need to ask. Solutions assembled themselves around him, eager to prove loyalty. This was how his world worked. Pain was temporary. Problems were transactional. From the crowd's perspective, he looked composed despite the injury. Jaw set, shoulders squared, eyes sharp. A man used to winning did not collapse in public. Even now, as his leg throbbed and the cold crept higher, he measured the situation like a hostile negotiation: minimize exposure, maximize outcome, exit cleanly. Yet beneath that discipline, something strained. Ethan hated unpredictability. Markets could be volatile, people unreliable, but systems, when designed correctly, bent toward profit. He trusted numbers more than intentions, leverage more than mercy. Charity to him had always been strategic, a foundation here, a gala there, goodwill converted into influence. Giving was acceptable as long as it preserved control. The stranger disrupted that order. While others looked away or whispered, the man remained unmovable, neither impressed nor intimidated. He did not acknowledge Ethan's reputation, nor the security presence, nor the cameras. His calm felt intrusive, almost offensive, as if refusing to recognize the hierarchy everyone else respected. Some in the crowd sensed the imbalance. A junior aide tightened her grip on her phone, uneasy. A hotel guest frowned, unsettled by the way the stranger held Ethan's gaze. Not defiant, not submissive, but level. This was not how things were supposed to work. Inside Ethan, irritation rose first. Who asked for food in exchange for healing? The logic was backwards. Power dictated terms. Power set the price. He told himself the man was irrelevant, another variable to dismiss. But pain has a way of stripping illusion. As minutes passed, the ache in his leg refused to be negotiated. No amount of status eased it further. He could not command it into silence. For the first time in years, Ethan felt the limits of authority pressing inward, exposing something he rarely confronted: dependence. Across from him stood Jesus Christ in disguise, unnoticed by most, unreadable by all. The man did not hurry Ethan's decision. He offered no reassurance, no pressure. Control, it seemed, was not the currency being exchanged. And that was what unsettled Ethan most. Because in a life built on leverage, the idea of surrender, of needing something that could not be bought, felt more dangerous than the injury itself. He did not arrive with urgency. While security scanned faces and aides debated logistics, the man stood quietly at the edge of the circle, almost overlooked. His coat was too thin for the weather, its seams worn smooth by time. Snow dusted his shoulders without complaint. To most eyes, he blended into the background of the city, the kind of figure people learn to see past on their way to somewhere else. Yet presence is not always loud. A hotel employee noticed him first pausing mid-step with a tray still in hand. Then a passerby drawn not by movement, but by stillness. The man's posture was relaxed, not slouched with defeat, nor tense with expectation. His gaze traveled slowly, resting on faces as if weighing something deeper than appearances. To the crowd, he was an inconvenience at best. Security shifted instinctively, narrowing the perimeter. One guard murmured that they should move him along before things escalated. An aide frowned, already calculating how the optics would look if a homeless man lingered too close to a wealthy client. In their world, proximity itself was a risk, but the man did not advance. He waited. A veteran on the sidewalk recognized the look in his eyes and lowered his head slightly, unsure why. A young woman filming hesitated, her phone dipping as discomfort replaced curiosity. Something about the stranger unsettled people, not fear, but the sense of being seen without permission. Then he stepped forward just one pace. No dramatic gesture followed, no plea, no raised voice. He simply positioned himself where Ethan Walker could no longer ignore him, close enough to be heard without shouting, far enough to show no threat. For the first time, the noise of the street softened. Ethan looked at him fully now, irritated by the interruption, surprised by the calm. The man's hands were rough, marked by work and exposure, yet steady. There was no hunger in his eyes, no desperation. If anything, there was restraint, as if he carried something heavy and chose not to drop it on others. The contrast sharpened in the cold light, a man with everything immobilized by pain, and a man with nothing standing unafraid. Somewhere behind them, laughter from the hotel spilled into the night, sharp and fleeting. On the sidewalk, breath rose in visible clouds, shared equally by billionaire and beggar alike. The stranger spoke again, quietly enough that those closest leaned in without realizing it. His words were simple, stripped of flourish, almost ordinary. That simplicity made them harder to dismiss. And in that moment, before anything miraculous occurred, before identities were revealed or choices demanded, the power dynamics shifted in a way no one could fully explain, because weakness, when carried without bitterness, has a gravity of its own. Standing there was Jesus Christ in disguise, not announced, not recognized, appearing not as authority, but as the least protected person on the street. He asked for nothing that would elevate him. He offered nothing that could be owned, only a presence that refused to disappear. And for reasons no one could yet name, the city seemed to pause, waiting to see whether anyone would truly look at the one they were used to ignoring. The offer, when it came, did not sound like an offer at all. Those closest expected a number, an outrageous sum perhaps, or a demand that could be negotiated down. That was how exchanges worked in Ethan Walker's world. Everything had a ceiling, a counter-proposal, a loophole. Even apologies could be priced. But the man spoke without calculation. "If I heal your leg," he said evenly, "will you give me food?" The words landed softly, yet they unsettled the circle more than any shout could have. A security guard let out a short, confused laugh. An aide blinked, waiting for the rest of the sentence, for the hidden clause that never came. Someone muttered that this was a joke, badly timed and poorly delivered. Food, not cash, not influence, not a promise of access or protection. Food, basic, ordinary, almost embarrassing in its simplicity. Ethan frowned, irritation tightening his jaw. To him, the request felt absurdly small, even insulting. He had endowed kitchens, sponsored galas where plates went untouched, written checks to organizations whose logos looked good on annual reports. If the man wanted food, it could be arranged in seconds. A call, a swipe, a receipt. But that was precisely the problem. The offer was not expensive in money. It was expensive in meaning. From the edge of the crowd, a hotel staff member shifted uncomfortably. A homeless woman across the street paused mid-bite, watching closely. She understood something the suits did not. Food given freely was different from food thrown away. Ethan searched the man's face for hunger, for leverage, for any sign this was another transaction waiting to be exploited. He found none. There was no urgency in the request, no desperation to sweeten the deal. It was presented not as a bargain, but as a question of character. Would you give me food? Not later, not publicly, not through a foundation or a press release. Directly, simply. An aide leaned in, whispering that they could have catering brought out immediately. Spin this as generosity. The suggestion hovered in the cold air, perfectly reasonable and entirely wrong. The man did not respond to the whisper. He was not negotiating with the system around Ethan. He was speaking only to the man himself. The crowd sensed it too. Phones lowered, jokes died halfway out of mouths. The street felt narrower, as if space itself were pressing for an answer. To accept the offer meant admitting dependence not on medicine or money but on mercy. To refuse meant exposing the limits of control that Ethan had spent a lifetime denying. And still the man waited. This was Jesus Christ in disguise, offering a condition that sounded small enough to ignore and heavy enough to undo a life built on leverage. He did not say the food had to be warm. He did not specify quantity or cost. He asked for no witnesses, no credit, only a response. Snow drifted between them. Somewhere nearby, a stomach growled no one could say whose. The question lingered quiet and relentless, stripping away contracts and titles until only a choice remained. Because some offers are not cheap precisely because they ask for the one thing money cannot secure: a willing heart. The silence that followed was not empty. It was crowded with calculations. Ethan Walker's mind moved the way it always had, fast, disciplined, defensive. He replayed the offer as if it were a faulty clause in a contract searching for hidden risk. Food was trivial. He could end this now, restore order, turn the moment into a charitable anecdote. Yet something in the simplicity of the request made his instincts hesitate. There was no leverage to seize, no advantage to secure. Pain flared in his leg, sharp enough to pull him back to the curb. He clenched his jaw, refusing to show it. Public weakness was a currency he never spent. Around him, aides waited for a signal. They mistook his pause for strategy, not doubt. Inside, the conflict deepened. Accepting meant acknowledging need, not the respectable kind that came with invoices and specialists, but a raw dependence that stripped him of authority. Refusing meant conceding that control had limits he could not tolerate. Either choice threatened the identity he had built with ruthless consistency. From the crowd's perspective, the hesitation looked like arrogance. A few whispered that he was enjoying the attention. Others assumed he was deciding how much to give. No one considered that the richest man on the sidewalk might be wrestling with something more expensive than money. Across from him, the stranger remained still. There was no impatience in his posture, no attempt to push the moment forward. He did not reassure Ethan that everything would be fine. He did not warn him of consequences. The absence of pressure made the decision heavier, not lighter. A security guard shifted his weight, uneasy with the delay. An aide leaned in again, suggesting an easy exit: buy food, make a show in the spectacle. Ethan almost nodded. The path of least resistance had solved countless problems before. But the man's eyes held him. They were not judging. They were waiting. Ethan felt irritation give way to something colder: fear. Not fear of injury, but of exposure. He sensed that this choice, however small it appeared, would reveal something he had kept buried beneath success and structure. He had mastered markets, dominated negotiations, outlasted rivals. He had never mastered surrender. The wind cut harder, stealing heat from his hands. He imagined the headlines if he faltered the shareholders' calls, if weakness crept into the narrative of strength he sold so well. He also imagined walking away unchanged, healed, or not carrying the same armor that had brought him here. Neither option offered comfort. Nearby, a woman clasped her coat tighter, feeling the tension without understanding it. A hotel guest checked the time, impatient. Life pressed forward, indifferent to Ethan's dilemma. And still the man did not move. This was Jesus Christ in disguise, presenting a conflict that could not be outsourced or spun. The injury demanded attention, but the decision demanded honesty. Ethan swallowed his breath, fogging the air. For the first time in years, he realized that power had not prepared him for this moment. Because the hardest battles are not fought in boardrooms or courts. They are fought in the space between pride and mercy, where no one can decide for you, and where delay itself becomes a choice. It happened without ceremony. No flash of light cut through the night. No voice thundered from the sky. The man simply knelt close enough that the crowd instinctively leaned back, unsure whether to intervene or witness. His hand hovered for a moment above Ethan's injured leg. Not dramatic, not urgent, almost hesitant, as if respecting a boundary that had not yet been crossed. Then he touched him. Those closest expected a reaction, pain, protest, something loud. Instead, Ethan inhaled sharply and froze. The familiar agony that had pulsed relentlessly since the accident softened, retreating like a tide pulling back from shore. It did not vanish, but it changed. Ethan blinked, confused. He shifted slightly, bracing for the stab of pain that should have followed. It didn't come. A murmur rippled through the onlookers. A security guard frowned, scanning for trickery. An aide instinctively reached for his phone, then stopped, unsure what he was seeing. The moment resisted explanation, and that unsettled everyone. Ethan's breath grew uneven, not from pain now, but from disbelief. He pressed his heel gently against the pavement. The leg responded. Weak, yes, but responsive. The sharp edge of suffering dulled into something manageable, almost distant. His shoulders dropped without his permission, as if his body had decided before his mind could object. "This isn't possible," someone whispered. The man withdrew his hand and stood. There was no triumph in his expression, no expectation of applause. He looked at Ethan, searching not for gratitude but for recognition of what had just begun, not what had finished. Because it wasn't finished. The crowd sensed that too. Relief mixed with confusion, excitement tempered by restraint. This was not a clean miracle wrapped in certainty. It was partial, incomplete enough to silence mockery, not enough to end the question hanging in the air. Ethan tested his weight again carefully. The leg held, though instability lingered. He could stand longer now. He could breathe. But he was not whole, and he knew it. Across the sidewalk, a woman covered her mouth, tears welling, without understanding why. A homeless veteran nodded once slowly, as if confirming something he had suspected all along. Phones rose again, but shakier this time, hands uncertain about what they were allowed to record. Ethan looked up at the man, his earlier arrogance stripped raw. He wanted to speak, thank him, challenge him, demand an explanation, but none of the words fit. The power dynamic had shifted again, this time inside his own body. The man said nothing. He did not announce a miracle. He did not claim credit. He allowed the moment to rest, incomplete by design. What had been given was not a cure, but a sign that healing was possible, a sign that it was not free. Standing there was Jesus Christ in disguise, offering just enough grace to quiet the crowd and awaken a deeper reckoning. The leg no longer screamed for attention, but the choice still did. Snow fell softly between them. And in that fragile pause, everyone understood that what came next would determine whether the healing would stop at the body or go somewhere far more dangerous. The moment did not stay on the sidewalk. Within minutes, fragments of the scene escaped to containment, blurred clips, uploaded captions, rewritten context, stripped down to shock and speculation. A man touches a millionaire's leg. Pain eases. Laughter turns to silence. Chicago's night became a feed, and the feed began to decide what the story meant. By the time the private ambulance arrived, the phones were no longer curious, they were accusatory. A junior aide stepped aside to take a call, her face draining of color. Another scrolled frantically, watching headlines assemble themselves in real time. The footage had already reached business blogs, then cable news producers, hungry for anything that blended wealth mystery and moral tension. The narrative splintered instantly. Some called it a staged stunt. Others called it fraud. A few used a word no one in Ethan Walker's circle liked to hear. Reckoning. Across town, a producer pitched the clip to a primetime panel. Across the river, a compliance officer at Ethan's firm paused the video, recognizing the sidewalk and the man. He forwarded it with a short message. This could reopen everything. The pressure tightened. Reporters arrived, their questions sharper than the cold. Had Ethan paid the man? Was this an illegal medical act? Was he exploiting religion for sympathy amid ongoing disputes? Security tried to move him toward the ambulance, but the street had turned into a stage and exits were no longer clean. Then the legal machinery began to stir. An old investigation, quietly dormant, found new oxygen. Emails resurfaced. Depositions were revisited. A source hinted that regulators were monitoring the situation. By dawn, insiders were whispering about coordination between federal agencies. Names long kept at bay crept back into conversations: U.S. Department of Justice and Internal Revenue Service criminal investigation. The sidewalk miracle had cracked a seal. Ethan felt it before anyone explained it. The relief in his leg was real, but so was the weight now settling on his chest. Healing had slowed the pain, not the consequences. The partial cure had bought him time, nothing more. From the crowd's perspective, the scene had changed entirely. What began as curiosity hardened into judgment. Some saw a powerful man cornered by truth. Others saw a con artist manipulating faith. Everyone sensed that this was no longer about an injury. Across from Ethan, the man who had touched him remained untouched by the surge. He watched the escalation with the same quiet composure, neither alarmed nor vindicated. Cameras glanced off him, unsure how to frame someone who refused to perform. An aide leaned in urgent now. "We need to leave. Now." Another warned that silence could be interpreted as guilt. Lawyers were patched in advising caution, distance denial. Ethan nodded mechanically, but his eyes returned to the man on the curb. He understood then that the sign he'd been given had done exactly what it was meant to do, not shield him from scrutiny, but summon it. The easing of pain had drawn a brighter light, and in that light there would be no hiding. Standing there was Jesus Christ in disguise, allowing the pressure to rise because pressure reveals what comfort never does. The healing had begun. The test had escalated. And the city, armed now with cameras and laws, waited to see whether Ethan would cling to, control, or submit to truth when it finally came with a price. The revelation did not arrive as an announcement. It arrived as recognition. As cameras repositioned and voices overlapped, Ethan Walker's attention narrowed to the man who remained strangely untouched by the chaos. Sirens, questions, legal warnings, none of it seemed to register with him. He stood exactly where he had been, as if the street itself had been waiting for this moment far longer than anyone realized. Ethan noticed the hands first. They were steady now, resting loosely at the man's sides. The skin was weathered, marked by age and labor, but there, faint yet unmistakable, were scars at the center of each palm. Not fresh, not accidental. Old wounds healed long ago, carried without explanation. Ethan's breath caught. Memory stirred uninvited. A childhood Bible left open by his grandmother. A painting in a church he had not entered in decades. Words he had dismissed as metaphor resurfaced with uncomfortable clarity. The logic-driven part of his mind scrambled for alternatives. Coincidence, suggestion, stress, but none of them held. The man met his eyes. There was no triumph there. No "now you see" satisfaction. Only a depth that felt impossibly patient, as if this recognition had been anticipated long before the accident, long before the sidewalk, long before Ethan's rise to power. Around them, others sensed the shift without understanding it. A reporter paused mid-question, unsettled by the silence. A police officer lowered his hand from his radio. Even the wind seemed to ease the city, briefly holding its breath. The man spoke again quietly, not to the cameras, not to the crowd, only to Ethan. The words were simple, familiar in a way that cut deeper than novelty. They did not explain the healing or address the scrutiny. They named something truer: the hunger beneath power, the emptiness beneath control, the cost of postponing mercy. Ethan felt the meaning land before the sound finished. This was not a healer passing through. This was not a parlor trick or a viral anomaly. This was Jesus Christ, not crowned, not exalted, not distant, present in the least protected place, revealed not by spectacle, but by scars. A woman in the crowd crossed herself without knowing why. A homeless veteran stepped back, eyes wet, whispering a prayer he hadn't spoken in years. Phones wavered, unsure whether filming now felt like trespassing. Ethan's chest tightened, not with fear, but with grief. Not grief for the injury or the investigations or the empire suddenly under threat. Grief for the years spent mastering a world that could never save him. He understood then why the healing had stopped halfway. This was not about proving divinity. It was about revealing choice. The city resumed its noise slowly, as if embarrassed by its interruption. Sirens continued. Reporters resumed speaking. Lawyers waited. But for Ethan, the world had already changed. Because once you recognize who stands before you, there is no neutral ground left. Only response. And the revelation, gentle yet devastating, made one truth impossible to escape. The question had never been whether his leg could be healed. It was whether his heart would finally answer when called by name. The choice did not come with thunder or deadlines. It came with clarity. Ethan Walker understood in that quiet after recognition that nothing more needed to be proven. The healing had paused where it did because the next step could not be forced. No signature would suffice. No donation could substitute. What stood before him was not a demand for belief, but an invitation to change direction, and to pay the price such change required. Around him, urgency pressed in. Lawyers urged restraint, reminding him that admissions could trigger consequences. Aides whispered about markets opening in a few hours, about investor confidence and reputational containment. Reporters waited for a statement that could be parsed and challenged. The system he had built was ready to protect him if only he would let it. Ethan looked down at his leg. It bore his weight now imperfectly but honestly. Enough to stand. Enough to walk if he chose to. He looked back at the man before him, at Jesus Christ in disguise, whose presence made every excuse feel smaller than it sounded. There was no instruction manual for what came next. Only a truth that refused to bend, healing that stops at the body, leaves the deeper wound untouched. The price of Huankai conversion was not symbolic. It was specific. It meant returning what had been taken through clever contracts and quiet pressure. It meant reopening cases his lawyers had buried under settlements. It meant stepping into public light without armor, accepting that justice might cost him wealth, status, and control. It meant giving food not as gesture, but as pattern, meeting need directly without applause. Ethan felt the resistance surge, fierce and familiar. This would hurt. Not physically, but socially, financially, existentially. The empire he had curated would not survive unchanged. Some doors would close forever. The crowd sensed the gravity of the moment. Whispers died. Cameras held steady. Even those who did not understand what was at stake felt that a line was being crossed. Ethan straightened. He spoke not loudly, not theatrically. He acknowledged what he owed. He named wrongs without cushioning language. He committed to restitution, to transparency, to facing whatever followed. Each word landed like a step off a ledge, irreversible and strangely grounding. There was no applause. There was relief. From the edge of the circle, a hotel employee exhaled. A veteran nodded once. A reporter lowered a microphone, unsure how to frame repentance in a world trained to chase scandal. Ethan felt the final change, not as spectacle, but as release. The pain in his leg loosened further, not with fireworks, but with completeness. He did not test it this time. He simply stood steady whole. The man smiled, not in approval, but in recognition. The work was not finished, but it had begun. And as the city resumed its restless rhythm, one truth lingered, heavier than consequence and brighter than healing. The miracle had never been the leg. It was the courage to choose truth when the cost was real. The consequences unfolded with a precision no publicist could choreograph. By morning, Ethan Walker's statement was no longer a rumor clipped for outrage. It was filed, time-stamped, and corroborated. Regulators moved not with spectacle, but with process. Subpoenas followed paper trails that had been whispered about for years. Depositions reopened. Audits widened. The machinery of American accountability, slow, methodical, unglamorous, did what it does best when finally invited in. At the center of it stood Ethan, no longer negotiating from a distance. He met investigators face to face. He authorized disclosures his attorneys had long advised against. Properties were returned, not rebranded. Settlements were renegotiated in daylight. In rooms without cameras, he listened to people who had lost homes, leveraged time. Some were angry. Some were stunned. None were invisible anymore. Justice, when it came, was not theatrical. It was granular. For the public, the story hardened into facts. Commentators argued whether repentance could coexist with prosecution. Markets reacted, then recalibrated. A board convened. Leadership changed. The empire did not collapse overnight, but it shifted permanently toward accountability. Federal agencies confirmed what insiders had sensed. U.S. Department of Justice acknowledged an active review. Internal Revenue Service criminal investigation traced flows that no longer hid behind complexity. There were penalties. There were consequences. No one pretended otherwise, yet something else moved alongside the law. In neighborhoods far from glass towers, restitution arrived without branding. Food pantries received steady deliveries. Rent relief reached families before press releases did. A small legal clinic opened its doors for tenants who had never expected to be heard. The work was quiet by design, inefficient for praise, effective for need. Those who watched closely noticed the difference. A hotel employee recognized Ethan weeks later, volunteering anonymously at a kitchen he once passed without seeing. A veteran who had stood on the sidewalk that night nodded again, this time with a smile that carried no bitterness. A reporter wrote a column that ended without a verdict, admitting that mercy does not erase justice, but it can accompany it. Ethan did not speak often after that. When he did, he spoke plainly. He did not frame losses as lessons or outcomes as redemption arcs. He acknowledged harm and named responsibility. He accepted that forgiveness, if it came, would not be owed. And yet healing continued, not as exemption from the law, but as alignment with it. Not as applause, but as peace that did not require denial. The city moved on as cities do, but something subtle remained, a recalibration of what power looks like when it chooses truth over insulation. Because justice had run its course, and mercy practiced daily without witnesses proved it was never meant to stop justice from working, only to ensure that when the work was done, something human could still grow in the space it cleared. The city eventually forgot the night itself. What endured was what followed. Months later, the sidewalk outside the hotel looked ordinary again. Salt stains on concrete traffic, flowing people moving with purpose. No plaque marked the spot. No memorial explained what had happened there. Chicago did not need reminders. It had received something quieter and far more durable. A foundation emerged without fanfare, its name absent from galas and donor walls. Its work was narrow by design: housing, stabilization, legal aid for tenants facing displacement, food delivered daily to shelters that never made headlines. No logos, no press tours, just continuity. People noticed not because it announced itself, but because it did not disappear. Ethan Walker was rarely mentioned in connection with it. Those who knew him before described the change in practical terms. He listened longer. He spoke less. He no longer treated outcomes as victories to be claimed, but responsibilities to be carried. When asked about the night his leg was healed, he never offered a story. He redirected attention to the work still unfinished. The healing had held, not as immunity from consequence, but as alignment with purpose. His walk was steady now, unremarkable in the way real recovery often is. The greater transformation, however, remained visible only to those paying attention, a relinquishing of control in places where control had once been absolute. Some wondered aloud whether mercy had let him off too easily. Others argued that justice had been too slow. The debate filled columns and comment sections, then faded as debates do. What could not be debated were the results: families housed, debts unwound, food served without conditions. On quiet evenings, a volunteer at a soup kitchen remembered a man who once asked only for food. She never saw him again. No one did. But occasionally someone would speak of a stranger who helped stack chairs after closing, who listened without correcting, who left before thanks could be offered. The descriptions never matched perfectly. They never needed to, because the legacy was never meant to point backward. Standing behind it all, unnamed, uncredited, was Jesus Christ, whose presence did not linger as spectacle, but as standard. The miracle had not been preserved in footage or framed as proof. It had been entrusted to human choice, multiplied quietly through obedience rather than awe. That was the inheritance of the night. Not a healed leg alone, but a reoriented life. Not absolution without cost, but mercy that insisted on truth. Not power reclaimed, but power redefined. And the city, indifferent yet responsive, absorbed the lesson the way cities always do, through the lives that change course within them. If this story stirred something familiar, if it raised questions about justice, mercy, and the choices that shape who we become, there are more like it waiting to be told. Subscribe to the channel for stories that go beyond miracles, into the decisions that follow them, where faith meets consequence, and ordinary streets become the setting for extraordinary change.